In Greece, Thrasybulus, who had been sent out by the Athenians with 30 ships and a strong force of hoplites as well as 100 horsemen, put in at Ephesus, and after disembarking his troops at 2 points, he launched assaults upon the city. The inhabitants came out of the city against them, and a fierce battle ensued, and since the entire populace of the Ephesians joined in the fighting, 400 Athenians were slain, and the remainder Thrasybulus took aboard his ships and sailed off to Lesbos. The Athenian generals, who were in the neighborhood of Cyzicus, sailing to Chalcedon, established there the fortress of Chrysopolis and left an adequate force behind, and the officers in charge they ordered to collect 1/10 from all merchants sailing out of the Pontus. After this, they divided their forces, and Theramenes was left behind with 50 ships with which to lay siege to Chalcedon and Byzantium, and Thrasybulus was sent to Thrace, where he brought the cities in those regions over to the Athenians, and Alcibiades, after giving Thrasybulus a separate command with the 30 ships, sailed to the territory held by Pharnabazes, and when they had conjointly laid waste a great amount of that territory, they not only sated the soldiers with plunder, but also themselves realized money from the booty, since they wished to relieve the Athenian people of the property taxes imposed for the prosecution of their war. When the Lacedaemonians learned that all the armaments of the Athenians were in the region of the Hellespont, they undertook a campaign against Pylos, which the Messenians held with a garrison. On the sea they had 11 ships, of which 5 were from Sicily and 6 were manned by their own citizens, while on land they had gathered an adequate army, and after investing the fortress they began to wreak havoc both by land and by sea. As soon as the Athenian people learned of this, they dispatched to the aid of the besieged 30 ships and his general Anytus, the son of Anthemion. Now, Anytus sailed out on his mission, but when he was unable to round Cape Malea because of storms, he returned to Athens. The people were so incensed at this that they accused him of treason and brought him to trial. But Anytus, being in great danger, saved his own life by the use of money, and he is reputed to have been the first Athenian to have bribed a jury. Meanwhile, the Messenians in Pylos held out for some time, awaiting aid from the Athenians. But since the enemy kept launching successive assaults, and of their own number some were dying of wounds, and others were reduced to sad straits for lack of food, they abandoned the place under a truce. And so the Lacedaemonians became masters of Pylos, after the Athenians had held it 15 years from the time Demosthenes had fortified it. While these events were taking place, the Megarians seized Nicaea, which was in the hands of Athenians, and the Athenians dispatched against them Leotrophides and Timarchus with 1,000 infantry and 400 cavalry. The Megarians went out to meet them en masse under arms, and after adding to their number some of the troops from Sicily, they drew up for battle near the hills called the Serrata. Since the Athenians fought brilliantly and put to flight the enemy, who greatly outnumbered them, many of the Megarians were slain, but only 20 Lacedaemonians. For the Athenians, made angry by the seizure of Nicaea, did not pursue the Lacedaemonians, but slew great numbers of the Megarians with whom they were indignant. The Lacedaemonians, having chosen Cratesipidas as admiral and manned 25 of their own ships with troops furnished by their allies, ordered them to go to the aid of their allies. Cratesipidas spent some time near Ionia without accomplishing anything worthy of mention, but later, after receiving mayhap from the exiles of Chios, he restored them to their homes and seized the Acropolis of the Chians, and the returned exiles of the Chians banished the men who were their political opponents and had been responsible for their exile to the number of approximately 600. These men then seized a place called Atarnius on the opposite mainland, which was by nature extremely rugged, and henceforth, from that as their base, continued to make war on their opponents who held Chios. While these events were taking place, Alcibiades and Thrasybulus, after fortifying Lampsacus, left a strong garrison in that place, and themselves sailed with their force to Theramenes, who was laying waste Chalcedon with 70 ships and 5,000 soldiers. And when the armaments had been brought together into one place, they threw a wooden stockade about the city from sea to sea. Hippocrates, who had been stationed by the Lacedaemonians in the city as commander, the Laconians call such a man a harmost, led against them both his own soldiers and all the Chalcedonians. A fierce battle ensued, and since the troops of Alcibiades fought stoutly, not only Hippocrates fell, but of the rest of the soldiers some were slain, and the others, disabled by wounds, took refuge in a body in the city. After this, Alcibiades sailed out into the Hellespont and to Chersonesus, wishing to contract money, and Theramenes concluded an agreement with the Chalcedonians whereby the Athenians received from them as much tribe as before. Then, leading his troops from there to Byzantium, he laid siege to the city and with great alacrity set about walling it off. And Alcibiades, after collecting money, persuaded many of the Thracians to join his army, and he also took into it the inhabitants of Chersonesus in mass. Then, setting forth with his entire force, he first took Celebria by betrayal, in which, after exacting from it much money, he left a garrison, and then himself came speedily to Theramenes at Byzantium. When the armaments had been united, the commanders began making the preparations for a siege, for they were setting out to conquer a city of great wealth which was crowded with defenders, since, not counting the Byzantines, who were many, Clearchus, the Lacedaemonian Harmost, had in the city many Peloponnesians and mercenaries. Consequently, though they kept launching assaults for some time, they continued to inflict no notable damage on the defenders. But when the governor left the city to visit Pharnabazus in order to get money, thereupon certain Byzantines, hating the severity of his administration, for Clearchus was a harsh man, agreed to deliver up the city to Alcibiades and his colleagues. The Athenian generals, giving the impression that they intended to raise the siege and take their armaments to Ionia, sailed out in the afternoon with all their ships and withdrew the land army some distance. But when night came, they turned back again, and about the middle of the night drew near the city, and they dispatched the triremes with orders to drag off the boats and to raise a clamour as if the entire force were at that point, while they themselves, holding the land army before the walls, watched for the signal which had been agreed upon with those who were yielding the city. And when the crews of the triremes set about carrying their orders, shattering some of the boats with their rams, trying to haul off others with their grappling irons, and all the while raising a tremendous outcry, the Peloponnesians in the city, and everyone who was unaware of the trickery, rushed out to the harbours to bring aid. Consequently, the betrayers of the city raised the signal from the wall and admitted Alcibiades' troops by means of ladders in complete safety, since the multitude had thronged down to the harbour. When the Peloponnesians learned what had happened, at first they left half their troops at the harbour, and with the rest speedily rushed back to attack the walls which had been seized. And although practically the entire force of the Athenians had already effected an entrance, they nonetheless were not panic-stricken, but resisted stoutly for a long while and battled the Athenians with the help of the Byzantines. And in the end, the Athenians would not have conquered the city by fighting, had not Alcibiades, perceiving opportunity, had the announcement made that no wrong should be done to the Byzantines. For at this word the citizens changed sides and turned upon the Peloponnesians. Thereupon the most of them were slain fighting gallantly, and the survivors, about 500, fled for refuge to the altars of the temple. The Athenians returned the city to the Byzantines, having first made them allies, and then came to terms with the suppliants at the altars. The Athenians would take away their arms and carry their persons to Athens, turn them over to the decision of the Athenian people. At the end of the year, the Athenians bestowed the office of Archon upon Euctemon, and the Romans elected as consuls Marcus Papirius and Spurius Nautius, and the 93rd Olympiad was celebrated, that in which Eubatus of Cyrene won the Stadion. About this time, the Athenian generals, now that they had taken possession of Byzantium, proceeded against the Hellespont and took every one of the cities of that region, with the exception of Abydos. Then they left Diodorus and Mantitheus in charge with an adequate force, and themselves sailed to Athens with the ships and the spoils, having performed many great deeds for the fatherland. When they drew near the city, the populace in a body, overjoyed at their successes, came out to meet them, and great numbers of the aliens, as well as children and women, flocked to the Piraeus. For the return of the generals gave great cause for amazement, in that they brought no less than 200 captured vessels, a multitude of captive soldiers, and a great store of spoils, and their own triremes they had gone to great care to embellish with gilded arms and garlands, and, besides, with spoils and all such decoration. But most men thronged to the harbours to catch sight of Alcibiades, so that the city was entirely deserted, the slaves vying with the free. For at that time it had come to pass that this man was such an object of admiration that the leading Athenians thought that they had at long last found a strong man capable of opposing the people openly and boldly, while the poor had assumed that they would have in him an excellent supporter who would recklessly throw the city into confusion and relieve their destitute condition. For in boldness he far excelled all other men. He was a most eloquent speaker, in generalship he was unsurpassed, and in daring he was most successful. Furthermore, in appearance he was exceedingly handsome, and in spirit brilliant and intent upon great enterprises. In a word, practically all men had conceived such assumptions regarding him that they believed that, along with his return from exile, good fortune in their undertakings had also come again to the city. Furthermore, just as the Lacedaemonians enjoyed success while he was fighting on their side, so they expected that they, in turn, would again prosper when they had this man as an ally. So when the fleet came to land, the multitude turned to the ship of Alcibiades, and as he stepped from it, all gave their welcome to the man, congratulating him on both his successes and his return from exile. He in turn, after greeting the crowds kindly, called a meeting of the assembly, and offering a long defense of his conduct, he brought the masses into such a state of goodwill that all agreed that the city had been to blame for the decrees issued against him. Consequently, they not only returned to him his property, which they had confiscated, but went further and cast into the sea the stelae on which were written his sentence and all the other acts passed against him. And they also voted that the Eumolpidae should revoke the curse they had pronounced against him at the time when men believed he had profaned the mystery. And to cap all, they appointed him general with supreme power, both on land and on sea, and put in his hands all their armaments. They also chose as generals others whom he wished, namely Adimantus and Thrasybulus. Alcibiades manned 100 ships and sailed to Andros, and seizing Garium, a stronghold, strengthened it with a wall. And when the Andrians, together with the Peloponnesians who were guarding the city, came out against him en masse, a battle ensued in which the Athenians were the victors, and of the inhabitants of the city many were slain, and of those who escaped some were scattered throughout the countryside, and the rest found safety within the walls. As for Alcibiades, after having launched assaults upon the city, he left an adequate garrison in the fort he had occupied, appointing Thrasybulus commander, and himself sailed away with his force and ravaged both Cos and Rhodes, collecting abundant booty to support his soldiers. Although the Lacedaemonians had entirely lost not only their sea force, but Mindarus the commander, together with it, nevertheless they did not let their spirits sink, but they chose as Admiral Lysander, a man who was believed to excel all others in skill as a general, and who possessed a daring that was ready to meet every situation. As soon as Lysander assumed the command, he enrolled an adequate number of soldiers from the Peloponnesus, and also manned as many ships as he was able. Sailing to Rhodes, he added to his force the ships which the cities of Rhodes possessed, and then sailed to Ephesus and Miletus. After equipping the triremes in these cities, he summoned those which were supplied by Chios, and thus fitted out at Ephesus a fleet of approximately 70 ships. And hearing that Cyrus, the son of King Darius, had been dispatched by his father to aid the Lacedaemonians in the war, he went to him at Sardes, and stirring up the youth's enthusiasm for the war against the Athenians, he received on the spot 10,000 darics for the pay of his soldiers, and for the future Cyrus told him to make requests without reserve, since, as he stated, he carried orders from his father to supply the Lacedaemonians with whatever they should want. Then Lysander, returning to Ephesus, called to him the most influential men of the cities, and arranging with them to form cabals, he promised that if his undertakings were successful, he would put each group in control of its city. And it came to pass for this reason that these men, vying with one another, gave greater aid than was required of them, and that Lysander was quickly supplied in startling fashion with all the equipment that is useful in war. When Alcibiades learned that Lysander was fitting out his fleet in Ephesus, he set sail for there with all his ships. He sailed up to the harbours, but when no one came out against him, he had most of his ships cast anchor at Notium, entrusting the command of them to Antiochus, his personal pilot, with orders not to accept battle until he should be present, while he took the troop ships and sailed in haste to Clazomene, for this city, which was an ally of the Athenians, was suffering from forays by some of its exile. But Antiochus, who was by nature an impetuous man and was eager to accomplish some brilliant deed on his own account, paid no attention to the orders of Alcibiades, but manning 10 of the best ships and ordering the captains to keep the others ready in case they should need to accept battle, he sailed up to the enemy in order to challenge them to battle. But Lysander, who had learned from certain deserters of the departure of Alcibiades and his best soldiers, decided that the favorable time had come for him to strike a blow worthy of Sparta. Accordingly, putting out to sea for the attack with all his ships, he encountered the leading one of the 10 ships, the one on which Antiochus had taken his place for the attack, and sank it, and then, putting the rest to flight, he chased them until the Athenian captains manned the rest of their vessels and came to the rescue, but in no battle order at all. In the sea battle which followed between the two entire fleets not far from the land, the Athenians, because of their disorder, were defeated and lost 22 ships, but of their crews only a few were taken captive and the rest swam to safety ashore. When Alcibiades learned what had taken place, he returned in haste to Notium and manning all the triremes sailed to the harbours which were held by the enemy. But, since Lysander would not venture to come out against him, he directed his course to Samos. While these events were taking place, Thrasybulus, the Athenian general, sailing to Thasos with 15 ships defeated in battle, the troops who came out from the city and slew about 200 of them. Then, having bottled them up in a siege of the city, he forced them to receive back their exiles, that is the men who favoured the Athenians, to accept a garrison and to be allies of the Athenians. After this, sailing to Abdera, he brought that city, which at that time was among the most powerful in Thrace, over to the side of the Athenians. Now the foregoing is what the Athenian generals had accomplished since they sailed from Athens. But Agis, the king of the Lacedaemonians, as it happened, was at the time in Thessalia with his army, and when he learned that the best Athenian troops were engaged in an expedition with Alcibiades, he led his army on a moonless night to Athens. He had 28,000 infantry, one half of whom were picked hoplites and the other half light-armed troops. There were also attached to his army some 1,200 cavalry, of whom the Boeotians furnished 900, and the rest had been sent with him by Peloponnesians. As he drew near the city, he came upon the outposts before they were aware of him, and easily dispersing them because they were taken by surprise, he slew a few and pursued the rest within the walls. When the Athenians learned what had happened, they issued orders for all the older men and the sturdiest of the youth to present themselves under arms. Since these promptly responded to the call, the circuit of the wall was manned with those who had rushed together to meet the common peril, and the Athenian generals, when in the morning they surveyed the army of the enemy extended in a line 4 men deep and 8 stades in length, at the moment were at first dismayed, seeing as they did that approximately 2/3 of the wall was surrounded by the enemy. After this, however, they sent out their cavalry, who were about equal in number to the opposing cavalry, and when the two bodies met in a cavalry battle before the city, sharp fighting ensued which lasted for some time. For the line of the infantry was some 5 stades from the wall, but the cavalry, which had engaged each other, were fighting at the very wall. Now the Boeotians, who by themselves alone had formerly defeated the Athenians at Delium, thought it would be a terrible thing if they should prove to be inferior to the men they had once conquered, while the Athenians, since they had as spectators of their valour the populace standing upon the walls and were known everyone to them, were ready to endure everything for the sake of victory. Finally, overpowering their opponents, they slew great numbers of them and pursued the remainder as far as the line of the infantry. After this, when the infantry advanced against them, they withdrew within the city. Agis, deciding for the time not to lay siege to the city, pitched camp in the academy, but on the next day, after the Athenians had set up a trophy, he drew up his army in battle order and challenged the troops in the city to fight it out for the possession of the trophy. The Athenians led forth their soldiers and drew them up along the wall, and at first the Lacedaemonians advanced to offer battle, but since a great multitude of missiles was hurled at them from the walls, they led their army away from the city. After this, they ravaged the rest of Attica and then departed to the Peloponnesus. Alcibiades, having sailed with all his ships from Samos to Syme, hurled false charges against the Chimaeans, since he wished to have an excuse for plundering their territory. And at the outset he gained possession of many captives and was taking them to his ships. But when the men of the city came out en masse to the rescue and fell unexpectedly on Alcibiades' troops, for a time they stood off the attack. But as later many from the city and countryside reinforced the Samaeans, they were forced to abandon their prisoners and flee for safety to their ships. Alcibiades, being greatly distressed by his reverses, summoned his hoplites from Mytilene, and drawing up his army before the city he challenged the Samaeans to battle. But when no one came out of the city, he ravaged its territory and sailed off to Mytilene. The Samaeans dispatched an embassy to Athens and denounced Alcibiades for having laid waste an allied city which had done no wrong, and there were also many other charges brought against him. For some of the soldiers at Samos, who were at odds with him, sailed to Athens and accused Alcibiades in the assembly of favouring the Lacedaemonian cause and of forming ties of friendship with Pharnabazus, whereby he hoped that at the conclusion of the war he should lord it over his fellow citizen. Since the multitude soon began to believe these accusations, not only was the fame of Alcibiades damaged because of his defeat in the sea battle and the wrongs he had committed against time, but the Athenian people, viewing with suspicion the boldness of the man, chose as the 10 generals Conon, Lysias, Diomedon, and Pericles, and in addition Erasinades, Aristocrates, Archistratus, Protomachus, Protomachus, Thrasybulus, and Aristogenes. Of these, they gave first place to Conon and dispatched him at once to take over the fleet from Alcibiades. After Alcibiades had relinquished his command to Conon and handed over his armaments, he gave up any thought of returning to Athens, but with one trireme withdrew to Pacte in Thrace since, apart from the anger of the multitude, he was afraid of the lawsuits which had been brought against him. For there were many who, on seeing how he was hated, had filed numerous complaints against him, the most important of which was the one about the horses, involving the sum of 8 talents. Diomedes, it appears, one of his friends, had sent in his care a 4-horse team to Olympia, and Alcibiades, when entering it in the usual way, listed the horses as his own, and when he was the victor in the 4-horse race, Alcibiades took for himself the glory of the victory and did not return the horses to the man who had entrusted them to his care. As he thought about all these things, he was afraid lest the Athenians, seizing a suitable occasion, would inflict punishment upon him for all the wrongs he had committed against them. Consequently, he himself condemned himself to exile. The 2-horse chariot race was added in this same Olympic festival, and, among the Lacedaemonians, Pleistanax, their king, died after a reign of 50 years, and Pausanias succeeded to the throne and reigned for 14 years. Also, the inhabitants of the island of Rhodes left the cities of Ialysus, Lindus, and Camirus and settled in one city, that which is now called Rhodes. Hermocrates, the Syracusan, taking his soldiers, set out from Selinus, and on arriving at Himera, he pitched camp in the suburbs of the city, which lay in ruins. And finding out the place where the Syracusans had made their stand, he collected the bones of the dead, and putting them upon wagons which he had constructed and embellished at great cost, he conveyed them to Syracuse. Now Hermocrates himself stopped at the border of Syracusan territory, since the exiles were forbidden by the laws from accompanying the bones farther, but he sent on some of his troops who brought the wagons to Syracuse. Hermocrates acted in this way in order that Diocles, who opposed his return and was generally believed to be responsible for lack of concern over the failure to bury the dead, should fall out with the masses, whereas he, by his humane consideration for the dead, would win the multitude back to the feeling of goodwill in which they had formerly held him. Now, when the bones had been brought into the city, civil discord arose among the masses, Diocles objecting to their burial and the majority favouring it. Finally, the Syracusans not only buried the remains of the dead, but also, by turning out en masse, paid honour to the burial procession. Diocles was exiled, but even so they did not receive Hermocrates back, since they were wary of the daring of the man and feared lest, once he had gained a position of leadership, he should proclaim himself tyrant. Accordingly, Hermocrates, seeing that the time was not opportune for resorting to force, withdrew again to Selinus. But some time later, when his friends sent for him, he set out with 3,000 soldiers, and making his way through the territory of Gela, he arrived at night at the place agreed upon. Although not all his soldiers had been able to accompany him, Hermocrates, with a small number of them, came to the gate on Acradine, and when he found that some of his friends had already occupied the region, he waited to pick up the latecomers. But when the Syracusans heard what had happened, they gathered in the marketplace under arms, and here since they appeared accompanied by a great multitude, they slew both Hermocrates and most of his supporters. Those who had not been killed in the fighting were brought to trial and sentenced to exile. Consequently, some of them who had been severely wounded were reported by their relatives as having died, in order that they might not be given over to the wrath of the multitude. Among their number was Dionysius, who later became tyrant of the Syracusans. When the events of this year came to an end, in Athens Antigenes took over the office of Archon, and the Romans elected as consuls Gaius Manius and Gaius Valerius and Gaius Valerius. About this time, Conon, the Athenian general, now that he had taken over the armaments in Samos, fitted out the ships which were in that place and also collected those of the allies, since he was intent upon making his fleet a match for the ships of the enemy. And the Spartans, when Lysander's period of command as admiral had expired, dispatched Callicratidas to succeed him. Callicratidas was a very young man, without guile and straightforward in character, since he had had as yet no experience of the ways of foreign peoples, and was the most just man among the Spartans. And it is agreed by all that also, during his period of command, he committed no wrong against either a city or a private citizen, but dealt summarily with those who tried to corrupt him with money and had them punished. He put in at Ephesus and took over the fleet, and since he had already sent for the ships of the allies, the sum total he took over, including those of Lysander, was 140. And since the Athenians had Delphinium in the territory of the Chians, he sailed against them with all his ships and undertook to lay siege to it. The Athenians, who numbered some 500, were dismayed at the great size of his force and abandoned the place, passing through the enemy under a truce. Callicratidas took over the fortress and levelled it to the ground, and then, sailing against the Thayers, he stole inside the walls of the city by night and plundered it. After this, he sailed to Lesbos and with his force attacked Methymne, which held a garrison of Athenians. Although he launched repeated assaults, at first he accomplished nothing, but soon afterward, with the help of certain men who betrayed the city to him, he broke inside its walls, and although he plundered its wealth, he spared lives of the inhabitants and returned the city to the Methymnians. After these exploits, he made for Mytilene, and assigning the hoplites to Thorax, the Lacedaemonian, he ordered him to advance by land with all speed and himself sailed on past Thorax with his fleet. Conon, the Athenian general, had 70 ships which he had fitted out with everything necessary for making war at sea more carefully than any other general had ever done by way of preparation. Now it so happened that he had put out to sea with all his ships when he went to the aid of Methymne, but on discovering that it had already fallen, at the time he had bivouacked at one of the 100 Isles, as they are called, and at daybreak, when he observed that the enemy's ships were bearing down on him, he decided that it would be dangerous for him to join battle in that place with triremes double his in number, but he planned to avoid battle by sailing outside the Isles and drawing some of the enemy's triremes after him to engage them off Mytilene. Or, by such tactics, he assumed, in case of victory he could turn about and pursue, and in case of defeat he could withdraw for safety to the harbour. Consequently, having put his soldiers on board ship, he set out with the oars at a leisurely stroke in order that the ships of the Peloponnesians might draw near him, and the Lacedaemonians, as they approached, kept driving the ships faster and faster in the hope of seizing the hindmost ships of the enemy. As Conon withdrew, the commanders of the best ships of the plebeians pushed the pursuit hotly, and they wore out the rowers by their continued exertion at the oars, and were themselves separated a long distance from the others. Conon, noticing this, when his ships were already near Mytilene, raised from his flagship a red banner, for this was a signal for the captains of the triremes. At this, his ships, even as the enemy was overhauling them, suddenly turned about at the same moment, and the crews raised the battle song and the trumpeters sounded the attack. The Peloponnesians, dismayed at the turn of events, hastily endeavoured to draw up their ships to repel the attack, but as there was not time for them to turn about, they had fallen into great confusion because the ships coming up after them had left their accustomed position. Conon, making clever use of the opportunity, at once pressed upon them and prevented their establishing any order, damaging some ships and shearing off the rows of oars of others. Of the ships opposing Conon, not one turned to flight, but they continued to back water while waiting for the ships which tarried behind. But the Athenians, who held the left wing, putting to flight their opponents, pressed upon them with increasing eagerness and pursued them for a long time. But when the Peloponnesians had brought all their ships together, Conon, fearing the superior numbers of the enemy, stopped the pursuit and sailed off to Mytilene with 40 ships. As for the Athenians who had set out in pursuit, all the Peloponnesian ships, swarming around them, struck terror into them, and cutting them off from return to the city, compelled them to turn in flight to land. And since the Peloponnesians pressed upon them with all their ships, the Athenians, seeing no other means of deliverance, fled for safety to the land, and deserting their vessels found refuge in Mytilene. Callicratidas, by the capture of 30 ships, was aware that the naval power of the enemy had been destroyed, but he anticipated that the fighting on land remained. Consequently, he sailed on to the city, and Conon, who was expecting a siege when he arrived, began upon preparations about the entrance to the harbour. Or, in the shallow places of the harbour, he sank small boats filled with rocks, and in the deep waters he anchored merchantmen armed with stones. Now the Athenians and a great throng of the Mytilenaeans who had gathered from the fields into the city because of the war speedily completed preparations for the siege. Callicratidas, disembarking his soldiers on the beach near the city, pitched a camp, and then he set up a trophy for the sea battle. And on the next day, after choosing out his beside ships and commanding them not to get far from his own ship, he put out to sea, being eager to sail into the harbour and break the barrier constructed by the enemy. Conon put some of his soldiers on the triremes, which he placed with their prows facing the open passage, and some he assigned to the large vessels, while others he sent to the breakwaters of the harbour, in order that the harbour might be fenced in on every side, both by land and by sea. Then Conon himself with his triremes joined the battle, filling with his ships the space lying between the barriers, and the soldiers stationed on the large ships hurled the stones from the yardarms upon the ships of the enemy, while those drawn up on the breakwaters of the harbour held off those who might have ventured to disembark on the land. The Peloponnesians were not a whit outdone by the emulation displayed by the Athenians. Advancing with their ships in mass formation and with their best soldiers lined up on the decks, they made the sea battle also a fight between infantry, for as they pressed upon their opponents' ships, they boldly boarded their prows, in the belief that men who had once been defeated would not stand up to the terror of battle. But the Athenians and Mytilenaeans, seeing that the single hope of safety left to them lay in their victory, were resolved to die nobly rather than leave their station. And so, since an unsurpassable emulation pervaded both forces, a great slaughter ensued, all the participants exposing their bodies, without regard of risk, to the perils of battle. The soldiers on the decks were wounded by the multitude of missiles which flew at them, and some of them, who were mortally struck, fell into the sea, while some, so long as their wounds were fresh, fought on without feeling them. But very many fell victims to the stones that were hurled by the stone-carrying yardarms, since the Athenians kept up a shower of huge stones from these commanding positions. The fighting had continued nonetheless for a long while, and many had met death on both sides, when Callicratidas, wishing to give his soldiers a breathing spell, sounded the recall. After some time, he again manned his ships and continued the struggle over a long period, and with great effort, by means of the superior number of his ships and the strength of the marines, he thrust out the Athenians. And when the Athenians fled for refuge to the harbour within the city, he sailed through the barriers and brought his ships to anchor near the city of the Mytilenaeans. It may be explained that the entrance for whose control they had fought had a good harbour, which, however, lies outside the city. For the ancient city is a small island, and the later city, which was founded near it, is opposite it on the island of Lesbos, and between the two cities is a narrow strait which also adds strength to the city. Callicratidas now, disembarking his troops, invested the city and launched assaults upon it from every side. Such was the state of affairs at Mytilene. In Sicily, the Syracusans, sending ambassadors to Carthage, not only censured them for the war, but required that for the future they cease from hostilities. To them, the Carthaginians gave ambiguous answers and set about assembling great armaments in Libya, since their desire was fixed on enslaving all the cities of the island. But before sending their forces across to Sicily, they picked out volunteers from their citizens and the other inhabitants of Libya and founded in Sicily, right at the warm Therma, springs a city, which they named Therma. When the events of this year came to an end, in Athens Callias succeeded to the office of Archon, and in Rome The consuls elected were Lucius Furius and Gnaeus Pompeius. At this time, the Carthaginians, being elated over their successes in Sicily and eager to become lords of the whole island, voted to prepare great armaments, and electing as General Hannibal, who had razed to the ground both the city of the Selinuntians and that of the Himerians, they committed to him full authority over the conduct of the war. When he begged to be excused because of his age, they appointed besides him another general, Himilcon, the son of Hanno and of the same family. These two, after full consultation, dispatched certain citizens who were held in high esteem among the Carthaginians with large sums of money, some to Iberia and others to the Balearides Islands, with orders to recruit as many mercenaries as possible. And they themselves canvassed Libya, enrolling as soldiers Libyans and Phoenicians and the stoutest from among their own citizens. Moreover, they summoned soldiers also from the nations and kings who were their allies, Maurusians and nomads, and certain peoples who dwell in the regions towards Cyrene. Also from Italy they hired Campanians and brought them over to Libya, for they knew that their aid would be of great assistance to them, and that the Campanians who had been left behind in Sicily, because they had fallen out with the Carthaginians, would fight on the side of the Sicilian Greeks. And when the armaments were finally assembled at Carthage, the sum total of the troops collected together with the cavalry was a little over 120,000, according to Timaeus, but 300,000, according to Ephorus. The Carthaginians, in preparation for their crossing over to Sicily, made ready and equipped all their triremes and also assembled more than 1,000 cargo ships, and when they dispatched in advance 40 triremes to Sicily, the Syracusans speedily appeared with about the same time number of warships in the region of Eryx. In the long sea battle which ensued 15 of the Phoenician ships were destroyed, and the rest, when night fell, fled for safety to the open sea. And when word of the defeat was brought to the Carthaginians, Hannibal the general set out to sea with 50 ships, since he was eager both to prevent the Syracusans from exploiting their advantage and to make the landing safe for his own armaments. When news of the reinforcements which Hannibal was bringing was noised throughout Sicily, everyone expected that his armaments would also be brought over at once. And the city, as they heard of the great scale of the preparations and came to the conclusion that the struggle was to be for their very existence, were distressed without measure. Accordingly, the Syracusans set about negotiating alliances both with the Greeks of Italy and with the Lacedaemonians, and they also continued to dispatch emissaries to the cities of Sicily to arouse the masses to fight for the common freedom. The Agrigantini, because they were the nearest to the empire of the Carthaginians, assumed what indeed took place, that the weight of the war would fall on them first. They decided, therefore, to gather not only their grain and other crops, but also all their possessions from the countryside within their walls. At this time, it so happened, both the city and the territory of the Agrigantini enjoyed great prosperity, which I think it would not be out of place for me to describe. Their vineyards excelled in their great extent and beauty, and the greater part of their territory was planted in olive trees, from which they gathered an abundant harvest and sold to Carthage. For since Libya at that time was not yet planted in fruit trees, the inhabitants of the territory belonging to Acrigas took in exchange for their products the wealth of Acrigas and accused fortunes of unbelievable size. Of this wealth there remain among them many evidences, which it will not foreign to our purpose to discuss briefly. Now the sacred buildings which they constructed, and especially the temple of Zeus, bear witness to the grand manner of the men of that day. Of the other sacred buildings some have been burned, and others completely destroyed because of the many times the city has been taken in war, but the completion of the temple of Zeus, which was ready to receive its roof, was prevented by the war. And after the war, since the city had been completely destroyed, never in the subsequent years did the Agrigantini find themselves able to finish their building. The temple has a length of 340 feet, a width of 60, and a height of 120, not including the foundation. And being as it is the largest temple in Sicily, it may not unreasonably be compared, so far as magnitude of its substructure is concerned, with the temples outside of Sicily, for even though, as it turned out, the design could not be carried out, the scale of the undertaking at any rate is clear. And though all other men build their temples either with walls forming the sides or with rows of columns thrown enclosing their sanctuaries, this temple combines both these plans, for the columns were built in with the walls, the part extending outside the temple being rounded and that within square, and the circumference of the outer part of the column, which extends from the wall, is 20 feet, and the body of a man may be contained in the fluting, while that of the inner part is 12 feet. The porticos were of enormous size and height, and in the east pediment they portrayed the battle between the gods and the giants, which excelled in size and beauty, and in the west the capture of Troy, in which each one of the heroes may be seen portrayed in a manner appropriate to his role. There was at that time also an artificial pool outside the city, 7 stades in circumference and 20 cubits deep. Into this they brought water and ingeniously contrived to produce a multitude of fish of every variety for their public feasting, and with the fish swans spent their time, and a vast multitude of every other kind of bird, so that the pool was an object of great delight to gaze upon. And witness to the luxury of the inhabitants is also the extravagant cost of the monuments which they erected, some adorned with sculptured race horses and others with the pet birds kept by girls and boys in their homes, monuments which Timaeus says he had seen extant even in his own lifetime. And in the Olympiad previous to the one we are discussing, namely the 92nd, when Exenatus of Acragas won the stadion, he was conducted into the city in a chariot, and in the procession there were, not to speak of the other things, 300 chariots belonging to citizens of Acragas. Speaking generally, they led from youth onward a manner of life which was luxurious, wearing as they did exceedingly delicate clothing and gold ornaments, and besides using strigils and oil flasks made of silver and even of gold. Among the Acragantini of that time, perhaps the richest man was Tellius, who had in his mansion a considerable number of guest chambers and used to station servants before his gates with orders to invite every stranger to be his guest. There were also many other Acragantini who did something of this kind, mingling with others in an old-fashioned and friendly manner. Consequently, also Empedocles speaks of them as havens of mercy for strangers unacquainted with evil. Indeed, once when 500 cavalry from Gela arrived there, during a wintry storm, as Timaeus says in his 15th book, Tellius entertained all of them by himself, and provided them all forthwith from his own stores with outer and undergarments. And Polyclitus, in his histories, describes the wine cellar in the house as still existing, and as he had himself seen it when in Acragas as a soldier. There were in it, he states, 300 great casks hewn out of the very rock, each of them with a capacity of 100 amphoras, and beside them was a wine vat plastered with stucco and with a capacity of 1,000 amphoras, from which the wine flowed into the cask. And we are told that Tellius was quite plain in appearance, but wonderful in character. So once, when he had been dispatched on an embassy to the people of Centoripa and came forward to speak before the assembly, the multitude broke into unseemly laughter as they saw how much he fell short of their expectation. But he, interrupting them, said, "Don't be surprised, for it is the practice of the Acragantini to send to famous cities their most handsome citizens, but to insignificant and most paltry cities men of their sort." It was not in the case of Tellius only that such magnificence of wealth occurred, he says, but also of many other inhabitants of Acraga. Antisthenes, at any rate, who was called Rhodus, when celebrating the marriage of his daughter, gave a party to all the citizens in the courtyards, where they all lived, and more than 800 chariots followed the bride in the procession. Furthermore, not only the men on horseback from the city itself, but also many from neighboring cities who had been invited to the wedding joined to form the escort of the bride. But most extraordinary of all, we are told, was the provision for its lighting. The altars in all the temples and those in the courtyards throughout the city he had piled high with wood, and to the shopkeepers he gave firewood and brush with orders that when a fire was kindled on the Acropolis they should all do the same, and when they did as they were ordered, at the time when the bride was brought to her home, since there were many torchbearers in the procession, the city was filled with light, and the main streets through which the procession was to pass could not contain the accompanying throng, all the inhabitants zealously emulating the man's grand manner. For at that time the citizens of Acragas numbered more than 20,000, and when resident aliens were included, not less than 200,000. And men say that once, when Antisthenes saw his son quarrelling with a neighboring farmer, a poor man, and pressing him to sell him his little plot of land, for a time he merely reproved his son, but when his son's cupidity grew more intense, He said to him that he should not be doing his best to make his neighbor poor, but, on the contrary, to make him rich. For then the man would long for more land, and when he would be unable to buy additional land from his neighbor, he would sell what he now had. Because of the immense prosperity prevailing in the city, the Aquilgrantini came to live on such a scale of luxury that a little later, when the city was under siege, they passed a decree about the guards who spent the nights at their posts, that none of them should have more than one mattress, one cover, one sheepskin, and 2 pillows. When such was their most rigorous kind of bedding, one can get an idea of the luxury which prevailed in their living generally. Now it was our wish neither to pass these matters by, nor yet to speak of them at greater length, in order that we may not fail to record the more important events. The Carthaginians, after transporting their armaments to Sicily, marched against the city of the Aquilgrantini and made 2 encampments, one on certain hills where they stationed the Iberians and some Libyans to the number of about 40,000, and the other they pitched not far from the city and surrounded it with deep trench and a palisade. And first they dispatched ambassadors to the Aquilgrantini, asking them, preferably, to become their allies, but otherwise to stay neutral and be friends with the Carthaginians, thereby remaining in peace. And when the inhabitants of the city would not entertain these terms, the siege was begun at once. The Aquilgrantini thereupon armed all those of military age, and forming them in battle order, they stationed one group upon the walls and the other as a reserve to replace the soldiers as they became worn out. Fighting with them was also Dexippus the Lacedaemonian, who had lately arrived there from Geer with 1,500 mercenaries. For at that time, as Timaeus says, Dexippus was tarrying in Geer, enjoying high regard by reason of the city of his birth. Consequently, the Aquilgrantini invited him to recruit as many mercenaries as he could and come to Acrigas, and together with them the companions who had formerly fought with Hannibal, some 800, were also hired. These mercenaries held the height above the city, which is called the Hill of Athena, and strategically situated overhanging the city. Hamilcar and Hannibal, the Carthaginian generals, noting, after they had surveyed the walls, that in one place the city was easily assailable, advanced 2 enormous towers against the wall. During the first day, they pressed the siege from these towers, and after inflicting many casualties, then sounded the recall for their soldiers. But when night had fallen, the defenders of the city launched a counterattack and burned the siege engine. Hannibal, being eager to launch assaults in an increasing number of places, ordered the soldiers to tear down the monuments and tombs and to build mounds extending to the walls. But when these works had been quickly completed because of the united labor of many hands, a deep superstitious fear fell upon the army. For it happened that the tomb of Thayer, which was exceedingly large, was shaken by a stroke of lightning. Consequently, when it was being torn down, certain soothsayers, presaging what might happen, forbade it, and at once a plague broke out in the army, and many died of it, while not a few suffered tortures and grievous distress. Among the dead was also Hannibal the general, and among the watchguards who were sent out there were some who reported that in the night spirits of the dead were to be seen. Hamilcar, on seeing how the throng was beset with superstitious fear, first of all put a stop to the destruction of the monuments, and then he supplicated the gods, after the custom of his people, by sacrificing a young boy to Cronus and a multitude of cattle to Poseidon by drowning them in the sea. He did not, however, neglect the siege works, but filling up the river which ran beside the city as far as the walls, he advanced all his siege engines against them and launched daily assaults. The Syracusans, seeing that Acrigas was under siege and fearing lest the besieged might suffer the same fate as befell the Selinuntians and Himerians, had long been eager to send them their aid, and when at this juncture allied troops arrived from Italy and Messene, they elected Daphnaeus general. Collecting their forces, they added along the way soldiers from Camarina and Geer, and summoning additional troops from the peoples of the interior, they made their way towards Acrigas, while 30 of their ships sailed along beside them. The forces, which they had numbered in all more than 30,000 infantry, and not less than 5,000 cavalry. When Hamilcar learned of the approach of the enemy, he dispatched to meet them both his Iberians and his companions, and more than 40,000 other troops. The Syracusans had already crossed the Himera River when the barbarians met them, and in the long battle which ensued the Syracusans were victorious and slew more than 6,000 men. They would have crushed the whole army completely and pursued it all the way to the city, but since the soldiers were pressing the pursuit without order, the general was concerned lest Hamilcar should appear with the rest of his army and retrieve the defeat. For he remembered also how the Himerians had been utterly destroyed for the same reason. However, when the barbarians were in flight to their camp before Acragas, the soldiers in the city, seeing the defeat of the Carthaginians, begged their generals to lead them out, saying that the opportunity had come to destroy the host of the enemy. But the generals, whether they had been bribed, as the report ran, or feared that Hamilcar would seize the city if it was stripped of defenders, checked the ardor of the men. So the fleeing men quite safely made good their escape to the camp before the city. But when Daphnaeus with his army arrived at the encampment which the barbarians had deserted, he took up his quarters there. At once both the soldiers from the city mingled with his troops, and Dexippus accompanied his men, and the multitude gathered in a tumultuous throng in an assembly, everyone being vexed that the opportunity had been let slip, and that, although they had the barbarians in their power, they had not inflicted on them the punishment they deserved, but that the generals in the city, although able to lead them forth to attack and destroy the host of the enemy, had let so many myriads of men off scot-free. While great uproar and tumult prevailed in the assembly, Menes of Camarina, who had been put in command, came forward and lodged an accusation against the Acragantine generals, and so incited all who were present that, when the accused tried to offer a defense, and one would let them speak, and the multitude began to throw stones and killed 4 of them, but the 5th, Argeus by name, who was very much younger, they spared. Dexippus, the Lacedaemonian, we are told, also was the object of abuse on the ground that, although he held a position of command and was reputed to be not inexperienced in warfare, he had acted as he did treacherously. After the assembly, Daphnaeus led forth his forces and undertook to lay siege to the camp of the Carthaginians, but when he saw that it had been fortified with great outlay, he gave up that design. However, by covering the roads with his cavalry, he seized such as were foraging, and by cutting off the transport of supplies, brought them into serious straits. The Carthaginians, not daring to wage a pitched battle and being hard pinched by lack of food, were enduring great misfortune. For many of the soldiers were dying of want, and the companions, together with the other mercenaries, almost in a body, forced their way to the tent of Hamilcar and demanded the rations which had been agreed upon, and if these were not given them, they threatened to go over to the enemy. But Hamilcar had learned from some source that the Syracusans were conveying a great amount of grain to Acragas by sea. Consequently, since this was the only hope he had of salvation, he persuaded the soldiers to wait a few days, giving them as a pledge the goblets belonging to the troops from Carthage. He then summoned 40 triremes from Panormus and Moti and planned an attack upon the ships which were bringing the supplies. And the Syracusans, because up to this time the barbarians had retired from the sea and winter had already set in, held the Carthaginians in contempt, feeling assured that they would not again have the courage to man their trireme. Consequently, since they gave little concern to the convoying of the supplies, Hamilcar, sailing forth unawares for 40 triremes, sank 8 of their warships and pursued the rest to the beach. And by capturing all the remaining vessels he effected such a reversal in the expectations of both sides that the companions who were in the service of the Acragantini, considering the position of the Greeks to be hopeless, were bought off for 15 talents and went over to the Carthaginians. The Acragantini at first, when the Carthaginians were faring badly, had enjoyed their grain and other supplies without stint, expecting all the while that the siege would be quickly lifted. But when the hopes of the barbarians began to rise and so many myriads of human beings were gathered into one city, the grain was exhausted before they were aware of it. And the story is told that also Dexippus the Lacedaemonian was corrupted by a bribe of 15 talents, for without hesitation he replied to a question of the generals of the Italian Greeks. Yes, it's better if the war is settled somewhere else, for our provisions have failed. Consequently, the generals, offering as their excuse that the time agreed upon for the campaign had elapsed, led their troops off to the strait. After the departure of these troops, the generals met with the commanders and decided to make a survey of the supply of grain in the city, and when they discovered that it was quite low, they perceived that they were compelled to desert the city. At once, then, they issued orders that all should leave on the next night. With such a throng of men, women, and children deserting the city, at once endless lamentation and tears pervaded all homes. For while they were panic-stricken from fear of the enemy, at the same time they were also under necessity, because of their haste of leaving behind as booty for the barbarians the possessions on which they had based their happiness. For when fortune was robbing them of the comforts they enjoyed in their homes, they thought that they should be content that at least they were preserving their lives. And one could see the abandonment not only of the opulence of so wealthy a city, but also of a multitude of human beings. For the sick were neglected by their relatives, everyone taking thought for his own safety, and those who were already far advanced in years were abandoned because of the weakness of old age. And many, reckoning even speculation from their native city to be the equivalent of death, laid hands upon themselves in order that they might breathe their last in the dwellings of their ancestors. However, the multitude which left the city was given armed escort by the soldiers to Geer, and the highway and all parts of the countryside which led away toward the territory of the Gelones were crowded with women and children intermingled with maidens who, changing from the pampered life to which they had been accustomed to a strenuous journey by foot and extreme hardship, held out to the end, since fear nerved their soul. Now these got safely to Geer, and at a later time made their home in Leontini, the Syracusans having given them this city for their dwelling place. Hamilcar, leading his army at dawn within the walls, put to death practically all who had been left behind. Yes, even those who had fled for safety to the temples the Carthaginians hauled out and slew. And we are told that Tellius, who was the foremost citizen in wealth and honorable character, shared in the misfortune of his country. He had decided to take refuge with certain others in the temple of Athena, thinking that the Carthaginians would refrain from acts of lawlessness against the gods, but when he saw their impiety, he set fire to the temple and burned himself together with the dedications in it. For by one deed, he thought, he would withhold from the gods impiety, from the enemy a vast store of plunder, and from himself, most important of all, certain physical indignity. But Hamilcar, after pillaging and industriously ransacking the temples and dwellings, collected as great a store of booty as a city could be expected to yield, which had been inhabited by 200,000 people, had gone unravaged since the date of its founding, had been well nigh the wealthiest of the Greek cities of that day, and whose citizens, furthermore, had shown their love of the beautiful and expensive collections of works of art of every description. Indeed, a multitude of paintings executed with the greatest care was found, and an extraordinary number of sculptures of every description and worked with great skill. The most valuable pieces, accordingly, Hamilcar sent to Carthage, among which, as it turned out, was the bull of Phalaris, and the rest of the pillage he sold as booty. As regards this bull, although Timaeus in his history has maintained that it never existed at all, he has been refuted by fortune herself. For some 260 years after the capture of Acragas, when Scipio sacked Carthage, he returned to the Acragantini, together with their other possessions still in the hands of the Carthaginians, the bull, which was still in Acragas at the time this history was being written. I have been led to speak of this matter rather copiously because Timaeus, who criticized most bitterly the historians before his time and left the writers of history bereft of all forgiveness, is himself caught improvising in the very province where he most proclaims his own accuracy. For historians should, in my opinion, be granted charity in errors that come of ignorance, since they are human beings and since the truth of ages past is hard to discover. But historians who deliberately do not give the exact facts should properly be open to censure whenever, in flattering one man or another, or in attacking others from hatred too bitterly, they stray from the truth. The Law Editor's Notes, 1 Thrasyllus, according to Xenophon Hell, 1.26f. The account is resumed from the end of chapter 53 to Atub Keep, 299, N4. 3 on the Hellespont opposite Byzantium. 4 editors have been troubled by Apollosus, CP. Critical note, here translated as give a separate command by pressing the meaning of the word in the sense of dismiss, whereas both Alcibiades and Thrasyllus were later engaged together in the raiding of Persian territory. But the word can also mean no more than the separate, as when a man separates, divorces, his wife. Xenophon, Hell, 1.2, 15f, states that the troops of Alcibiades refused at first to join with those of Thrasyllus because the latter had just suffered defeat before Ephesus, but later agreed to the union of the two armies after the successful raids. What Alcibiades probably did was to send Thrasyllus ahead, and the generals operated separately for a time. The critical note to the Greek text, meta ton triaconta neon apollusas, reads Apollosasa, Apollesas, Palma, Apokalesas, Riaiske. 5, or to press the Messenians hard, critical note. The critical note to the Greek text, Epothun ama kai kata gen kai kata thalaton, reads Epothun caps suggests Epothun post Epoliokaun. 6 later, one of the accusers of Socrates. 7 Seb, Book 12.63, 5. 8 the horns, lying opposite Salamis on the border between Attica and Megara, Sipi, Strabo 9.1, 11. 9 perhaps here and just below Sicilian Greeks should be read for Lacedaemonians, since the latter have not been mentioned as being present. Kipi critical note. The critical note to the Greek text, ton de Lacedaemonian ikosi monon, ikatalephthai, tos men Lacedaemonius, reads for Lacedaemonian and Lacedaemonius Vogel suggests Sicilioton and Siciliotas, respectively. 10 Thrasyllus, TP 299, none. 11 from sea to sea, i.e., from Bosporus to Propontis. 12 or Cilimbria, modern Silivri, on the Propontis. 13 Clearchus. 14, i.e., the boats of the Byzantines. 15 Xenophon, Hell, 1.3, 14f, does not mention this action in the harbour. 16 the Lacedaemonian base. 17 the sacerdotal family, which presided over the mysteries. Thayer's note. For details, see the article Eumolpidae and Smith's Dictionary of Greek and Roman Antiquity. 18 Cyrus the Younger, whose later attempt to win the Persian throne is told in Xenophon's Anabasis. Persia had finally decided to throw its power behind a combatant which could not support a fleet without Persian assistance. Cyrus was sent down as Caranus, lord of all those whose mustering place is Castolus, a plain probably near Sardes, i.e. as Governor-General of Asia Minor, Xenophon, Hell, 1.43, with abundant funds and orders to support the Lacedaemonians in the war. This decision of the great king was the death knell of the Athenian Empire. 19 Cyrus was 17 years of age. 20 a Persian coin containing about 125 grains of gold, worth approximately £1 sterling or $5. 21 on the north side of the large bay before Ephesus. 22 the birthplace of the great Greek physical philosopher Democritus. 23 the fortress in Attica which the Lacedaemonians, on the advice of Alcibiades, CP Chap 9.2, had permanently occupied. 24 Key, Book 12.70. 25 the grove of oliver trees, where Plato later had his school, 6 stades northwest of the Dippolon Gate. 26 in Lydia. 27 this should be Thrasyllus. 28 Alcibiades had acquired castles here and at Byzanti against some such contingency as this. 29 Key, Isocrates on the team of horses. 30 feared and distrusted in Athens, Sparta and Persia alike, the most brilliant man of action of his generation, whose judgment of public policies was as unerring as his personal aims, methods, and conduct were wrong, found outlet for his restless energy only in waging private war on the kingless Thracian. Had Athens been able to trust him, he might have saved her empire and destroyed her liberty. U.W.S. Ferguson in Cam, Ankh, Hist. 5, pre-154. 31 until this time the only chariot race had been that with teams of 4 horses, pp. Pausanias 5.8, 10, 32, the 93rd, 408 BCE. 33, the narrative is resumed from the end of Chap. 63, 34, CP, Chap, 61.6, 35, 405, 367 BCE. 36, Kp, Chap, 74.1. 37, carried on the yardarms. 38, presumably the merchantmen mentioned above. 39, the narrative is resumed from the end of Chap. 62. 40, it was near Hemera, Cicero, in Ver, 2.35. The springs are mentioned in Book 4.23. 41 Gnaeus Cornelius, Livy, 4.54. The Pompeys were a plebeian house, and the consulship was not yet open to plebeians. 42. A recently discovered inscription from Athens, a decree of the council mentioning Hannibal and Himilcon, has been published by B.D. Merritt, Athens and Carthage, Harvard Studies in Classical Philology, Supplementary Volume I, 1940, 240, 257, 253. Although the inscription is most fragmentary, it would appear that heralds from Carthage had come to Athens in connection with this invasion, and it is certain that the Athenians had sent a mission to confer with Hannibal and Himilcon in Sicily. 43. Key P. Chap. 62.5. 44 but CP. Book 4.17.4, where we are told that Heracles planted much of Libya in vineyards and olive orchards. 45. The actual dimensions of this great Olympiaeum are in English feet cc. 5, made longer than the Attic foot. Length, excluding steps, 361 foot. Breadth, 173.1.2. Height of columns with capitals 62.1.2. Diameter of columns at bottom 14. 46, i.e. they were engaged or half columns. See the frontispiece of this volume. Thayer's note. Of the 12 volumes of the Laub edition of Diodorus, only vol. 5, in which this book is found, is adorned with a frontispiece. Here it is. Temple of Zeus at Akragas, from R. Coldueo, Puchstein, die Griechischen Tempel in Unteritalien und Sicilien, 47 Timaeus died CE, 250 BCE. 48 he was victor not only in the 92nd Olympiad, 412 BCE, chap. 34, but also in the 91st, 416 BC, book 12.82. 49, the famous 5th century physical philosopher, a native of Akragas. 50, the third line of the opening lines of his work on purifications, which run, frag, 112 dels 5, o philoi, o mega astukata axantho akragantos, neetan akra polios, agathon melodimons ergen ekopal olios, agathon melodaimones ergen kel. My friends, who make your homes in the great settlement which forms golden Akragas, up on the heights of the city, ye who are careful to perform good deeds. Then the line Diodorus quotes. 51, a native of Larissa, and probably of the generation of Alexander the Great. 52, an amphora was about 9 gallons. 53 key p. Chaps. 44.1, 62.5. 54 tyrant of Akragas, 488, 472 BCE key. Book 11.53. 55 CP. Chaps. 57 and 62 respectively. 56 a Syracusan, later executed by Dionysius, infra chap. 96.3. 57 by a disorderly pursuit. Chap. 68 Finn. 58, presumably of Messina. 59, a little over 40 miles from Akragas. 60 CP. Book 9.1819. 61, in 146 BC. A previous next to images with borders lead to more information. The thicker the border, the more information. Details here. Thanks to Jonah Lendering of Livius for sharing in the labor of proofreading the web transcription of this book. Up to Diodorus Classical Texts, Lacus Goetius Home, a page or image on this site, is in the public domain only if its URL has a total of 1 asterisk. If the URL has 2 asterisks, the item is copyright someone else and used by permission or fair use. If the URL has none, the item is C. Bill Thayer. See my copyright page for details and contact information. Page updated, 5 Aug 16.